I thank the gentleman, and let me see seniority. Mr. Blumenauer, thank you for joining us. You're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Mica, I appreciate your ongoing efforts to sort of peel back the level of the onion with these hearings. Your courtesy in permitting us to join in, to follow the information, and it's certainly timely, and you've highlighted some areas of contradiction, and in this area, I think today's hearing is one that hopefully we can all agree there needs to be some progress. I appreciate Dr. Fleming not talking about which half of the brain are immature. I just think it may not always deal with chronology or early substance abuse, but I appreciate the benefit of the doubt. I also appreciate, I think he used the phrase 3 times in his opening statement, that no one has been able to prove, and then had a clause after that. And I think that's exactly the case. And that is why this is such an important hearing. It's because when we have 1 million people in the United States who are currently using medical marijuana legally under the laws of the 22, it looks like it's going to be 23 states now in the state of New York, and the District of Columbia, and then there are other states that are dealing with variations on this. It's inexcusable that we don't have better information. I'm embarrassed for this administration and previous administrations for not having a robust, effective program to be able to deal with the facts. I'm embarrassed when I'm at OHSU dealing with neuroscientists and physicians who are talking about patients that they have, similar to what Mr. Conley was talking about, who are having very positive results. And it is harder for those scientists and doctors to get marijuana to research than it is for parents to self-medicate the kids and really not knowing what they're being given. And part of that is the fault of the Federal Government and stupid policies. I would note for the record, Mr. Chairman, and ask respectfully that I could enter into the committee's record a letter dated June 17th, a bipartisan letter signed by 30 members of Congress to Secretary Burwell urging that there be changes in the research protocol.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It points out in the letter that only with marijuana and no other Schedule I substance is there an additional Public Health Service review for non-NIH funded protocols established in May 21st, 1999 in the Guidance for Procedures for Provision of Marijuana for Medical Research. We've got examples as well of people who are jumping through procedural hoops, people who are approved for research, and we've got this little narrow spigot that does not work. I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed for you having to be here to defend a broken system. I'm embarrassed that we, after years and years and years, and as the states are moving ahead of us, the Federal Government is not an effective partner to be able to have the information. Now, Dr. Fleming and I have modestly different views about what a sustainable marijuana policy should be. But we're absolutely in accord that we shouldn't be guessing, that we should have facts, we should have effective research. It should work for the American people. And I, Mr. Chairman, appreciate the courtesy of being able to join. I will be monitoring this. I'm bouncing back and forth between a Ways and Means hearing. I'm going to be here as much as I can. But I really think this is critically important. I appreciate you doing it and you and the ranking member allowing us to participate.
Thank you, Mr. Blumenauer. We'll start with some questions. Dr. Throckmorton, you don't set marijuana as a Schedule I narcotic, but you do participate in the process which you described. And I guess you recommend to DEA and DOJ, and you are not prepared to make any other recommendation but to keep it in Schedule I?
So in 2001 and again in 2006.
Right, 2001, 2006, you did the last studies. But right now, the question around the country is, this is classified as a Schedule I drug. We had DEA in. We didn't have a DOJ. We had a U.S. attorney. But the DEA was adamantly opposed to taking it, I think, out of a Schedule I classification. What's your position? Has it changed from the 2000? And you said 2001 they studied it, 2006 they studied it, and where are we now?
So if I could say, there are two reasons why the FDA conducts an 8-factor analysis, why we look at the scheduling of a product. And I think it might be worthwhile just making sure that we understand both of those, because they both relate to potentially to marijuana. The first is if we have a drug submitted to us for approval. So a new drug for an indication comes to us, including a drug that comes from marijuana, we would be required to conduct an analysis.
And you also testified that you're looking at several of, I don't know if I'm not a scientist, of derivatives, or one was Epidiolex?
Epidiolex, yes.
Epidiolex, that you're looking at that. And again, several others I think you indicated. And that's the first time I've heard testimony about, again, the direction you're taking on medical marijuana. But again, and that's part of your responsibility. I mean, I don't know how soon it's going to be before we see FDA-approved stamp on that stuff. Well, maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah.
But the process, too, of the Schedule I is part of what has been at issue here. We have DEA, we have the Department of Justice. We have, just in the District of Columbia, we have 26 Federal law enforcement agencies enforcing Federal law, and it is still an illegal narcotic in the highest classification. Are you about to change that?
I wouldn't be able to comment about potential changing of our recommendation. First, my recommendation would go through layers above me.
How could we get, can we get the?
Well, that was what I wanted to, that was why I wanted to talk a little about the two pathways. So,
well, one is I mean, you do have some studies that you're conducting about the medical benefits of some derivatives, and you are on the path of, but again, the major question is the Schedule I classification, and you're not prepared to say there's going to be any change.
What I'm prepared to say is that under two possible scenarios, we would have to conduct another 8-factor analysis on marijuana or its constituents. And either of those scenarios—
Do you plan to do an A-factor analysis? The last one was done in 2006, right?
The last one requested for us by the DEA. So there are the two ways are: one, a drug company submits a drug for application to us, and we conduct an 8-factor.
That's not what we're talking about.
And the second one, and I understand that's the center of your interest, is the one where the DEA requests that we conduct an additional 8-factor analysis. They've done, 2001, 2006 did those at those points, recommended that it remain in Schedule I. It's public knowledge that the DEA has received additional citizens petitions asking them to look again at the medical evidence surrounding the safety and effectiveness.
But that would bounce back to you.
And that has been sent to us, and we are in the process of conducting that 8-factor analysis. We've not yet come to a conclusion.
So you are conducting an A-factor analysis, an update?
Yes.
Okay. When do you expect that would be done?
I wouldn't be able to comment, partly because it's a recommendation first. So we make a recommendation to Health and Human Services after we consult with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and then that recommendation goes to the DEA.
And are you prepared to tell us, Dr. Valco, your recommendation at this point?
Well, I have to—
on moving forward.
I have to see exactly what the data is, and then definitively we'll act swiftly with the information.
So you're going to rely on the first data that's produced by the A-factor analysis, and then you would respond to that. That's the order? Okay. Dr. Hart, did you want to respond to anything?
Yeah, it seems to me that we need to clarify some of the, there's been some misinformation stated. There was a comment made about the average age of people who smoke marijuana now, begin smoking marijuana is like 10. That's just not true. It's about 17 or 18. And also, as we move forward and think about the increasing amount of marijuana potency, it certainly has increased. But the question becomes, what does that mean? When you think about potency and you think about people smoking marijuana, one of the advantages of smoking a drug compared to some other route of administration is that when you smoke a drug, you can quickly detect the potency or the strength of the psychoactive effects. So that means you will decrease the amount you intake. It's like drinking a stiff drink versus drinking a beer. You don't drink the two the same way. So this issue of potency has been overstated. Second point, when we think about gateway drug, as was been talked about here, it is true that the majority of the people who go on to use heroin and cocaine may have used marijuana first. That's true. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that the majority of the people who smoke marijuana don't go on to cocaine or heroin. If we're calling marijuana a gateway drug, we have to think about this fact. The last 3 occupants of the White House all smoked marijuana. If we use this logic about gateway, we could very well say that marijuana is a gateway drug to the White House. It just doesn't make sense. Finally, when we think about IQ, the study that has shown the decrease in IQ points, it's important to note the group that has shown the decrease in IQ points, there were 20 people in that group. And when you look at the IQ range that they have decreased to, they remain within the normal range. They are normal. And so it's important for people to understand what the science actually says.
Thank you, and we'll yield now to Mr. Conley.
Thank you, and I do want to remind Dr. Hart that one of those 3 presidents never inhaled.
That's what he said.
Dr. Throckmorton, I think the Chairman and I were both struck by your testimony because if we understood your testimony, you were acknowledging that, in fact, there were positive medicinal benefits in terms of medicinal treatment with a derivative of marijuana for epileptic seizures. Was that correct?
No. What I was saying was that there are people who are very enthusiastic about the potential for cannabidiol and THC and some of its derivatives to treat a number of important medical conditions. My job, given that potential, is to make sure that that development happens as quickly as possible.
Okay. But your testimony does not dismiss that possibility.
Absolutely not. I look forward to seeing the full data.
Okay. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but because both the Chairman and I thought we heard you acknowledge that at least there's some preliminary data beyond the placebo effect with respect to the treatment for epileptic seizures.
Yeah, I really wouldn't be able to comment on that.
Okay. You think the science is too early?
It's important science to get right.
But conversely, neither are you testifying that it is in fact only a placebo effect.
We have approved drugs from plants, and this plant has several compounds in it that people have identified as very promising. Our job is to get those developed.
I think that's really important because my colleague, Dr. Fleming, seemed to suggest it could only have a placebo effect, and in fact the science doesn't tell us that necessarily. The science may very well lead us to the fact that there is an empirical, efficacious medical effect that can benefit people like my constituent, Jennifer Collins, who suffers 300 seizures a day. It would come as news to her family that the effect is only a placebo effect. And let me just say, that family had to move their daughter to another state. She's separated from her friends at school. She's separated from her family for medical reasons, not to get a high, not for recreational use, but because her body is tormented 300 times a day with epileptic seizures. And we owe it to her and the other families in this country that may suffer from similar medical conditions to put aside the politics, put aside the bias scientifically that has prevented us from genuinely researching this topic to see whether, in fact, there can be an efficacious
Would the gentleman
effect.
yield?
I would briefly yield to my colleague.
Yeah, I never suggested that there was a placebo effect at all. All I said was that we have no proven benefit to seizures or otherwise, and that to simply go out and mass produce this, allow the population as a whole to use it, when in fact it is in research, and we are trying to find answers on this, makes no sense at all.
Reclaiming my time, and I thank my colleague. And by the way, I'd be delighted to have my colleague meet my constituents so that he could hear their story directly.
I would be happy to as well, but it's still an anecdotal.
But I would also just point out my friend has just created a straw man. No one's talking about mass production and letting everyone use it any way they want. That's not the topic of this hearing.
That's medicinal marijuana, sir.
Well, actually, talk to the 22 states.
There are more marijuana.
I have, excuse me, this is my time. But I would just suggest to my colleague, you can talk to the 22 states who have decided otherwise. And if Louisiana doesn't want to do it, that's its choice. But there are 22 states and the District of Columbia that have decided otherwise because they feel they've been held back at the Federal level. Now, Dr. Volkow, your testimony seems to completely disregard lots of other data. You referred to marijuana, as Dr. Hart said, as a gateway drug. Is there any evidence that marijuana is uniquely so, any more or less than other controlled substances?
I think that in my testimony, I explicitly stated that we have no evidence that marijuana as a gateway drug is different from alcohol and tobacco, and that tobacco, in fact, primes.
But isn't it even misleading to call it a gateway drug? I mean, if you've got an addictive personality, you started with something. It might be prescription drugs, it might be alcohol, it might be tobacco. I mean, there's no evidence that marijuana stands out among those other substances if you've got an addictive personality and you're going to go on to an addiction, is there?
No, absolutely. And if you have an addictive personality, it may just be what's more available as a young person that will just start to take first.
I guess I'm suggesting to you, however, given the data, for example, you only cited the addiction rate for marijuana. You didn't mention, in contrast to what? So 9% of the people who start out with marijuana become addicted. But you didn't mention that 33% of people who start out with tobacco become addicted. And as Dr. Hart pointed out, 15% with alcohol. What is it if you started out with cocaine? What's the addiction rate of that?
Cocaine is probably like 20, 25%.
Okay. So in all of these cases so far, they're much higher than marijuana.
Cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin are much higher than marijuana, but you need to, when you're making these comparisons, you have to compare within illegal and legal because the social changes make the perception different and make it much more available.
Well, I understand. But for you to only cite the addiction rate with marijuana seems to me to be cherry-picking statistics for a purpose.
I only had 5 minutes, and I apologize for not saying it because I always present all of the data, but I had 5 minutes.
All right. Dr. Hart had the same 5 minutes and managed to somehow put it in context. Let me ask you about NIDA. Right now, NIDA has a monopoly on the production of marijuana to be used for FDA-approved research and medical purposes, and that's been the case since 1974. Is that correct?
That is my understanding.
That's your understanding?
Yes.
Your title is Director.
Yes, that's my understanding. It's a use of words.
All right. Is there any other Schedule I drug used for research purposes that's available only from one government source like yours?
You were correct, and I don't think there is.
All right. So again, unique to marijuana, you have exclusive control for research purposes, unlike any other substance.
Correct, in the United States. Yes.
What's the rationale for that? Is there any rationale for that?
I guess that one of the rationales, that the reasons why this is described to be the case is that you want to be able to have control over the material that you are providing for research.
Why wouldn't that be true about cocaine?
Cocaine has different mechanisms for, I mean, it is a drug that is regulated differently vis-a-vis where we get it for researchers. The production of marijuana is based on plants.
Well, all right. DEA has licensed privately funded manufacturers to produce methamphetamines, LSD, MDMA, heroin, cocaine, and a host of other controlled substances for research purposes. Is that not correct?
They are, for research purposes, yes, and most of those go to preclinical studies, laboratory animals.
Right now, HHS guidelines prohibit the use of NIDA-produced marijuana for use in research designed to develop marijuana into an FDA-approved prescription medicine. Is that correct?
Not to my understanding. To my understanding is we provide the marijuana for clinical research that has been approved by the committee of the DEA, the FDA, and by
there's no restriction that says, but you can't use it for research that's aimed at producing an FDA-approved prescription medicine. Is that correct?
Well, there the wording, I don't want to be imprecise, because when you say the FDA-approved medication, since it is a Schedule I, I don't want to say something that is incorrect. We can fund research that can provide the evidence that then can be brought into the FDA to bring up an argument about why this should be considered as a medical application. That's what we do. And there's no, and we will—
Dr. Throckmorton, I'm sorry, but I have limited time. I appreciate your answer. Dr. Throckmorton, is that correct?
Could you say, just ask briefly again?
Yes.
Sorry.
The HHS guidelines prohibit the use of NIDA-produced marijuana, and it has a monopoly on it, for use in research that could be designed or is designed to develop marijuana into an FDA-approved prescription medicine.
No, I don't believe that's true. I believe, in fact, we do see applications that make use of the NIDA marijuana.
I would ask you both to get back to the committee for the record.
Absolutely.
Because that would be at variance with our understanding, but that's good to know. Human studies in Schedule I drugs have to be approved by the FDA. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
But studies involving marijuana, additional approval also has to be sought from NIDA and HHS. Is that not correct?
Scientifically, they have to be approved by a committee on NIDA.
Is that true about heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines? Do they have to go through that triple-tier approval process for research as well?
No,
on human studies?
The approval for those human studies, most of it comes from review committees at the NIH, and if the DEA approves of giving them the drug, then it's a different procedure.
But don't we? Yeah, it's a different process, and it's less cumbersome. What is it about marijuana? You know, I asked the deputy director of the DEA at one of our previous hearings, name a single death in America due to an overdose from marijuana. He couldn't do it. Prescription drugs, legal, every 19 minutes. We could cite other substances as well. Now, that's not to say, therefore, we should be concerned about marijuana. But it does raise the question of whether our behavior has been appropriate with respect to marijuana. The restrictions from research, the extraordinary incarceration, prosecution, and incarceration rates. Look at what we've unleashed. We've created a subclass of criminal behavior in America that seems out of proportion to the fact that, as Dr. Hart said, 80% are for small, possession. Now, ideally, they wouldn't have it at all. But we have really skewed the system. And we've created all kinds of special barriers with respect to marijuana as if it were the uber alles of all drug abuse, when in fact it is not. And we've impeded the ability to have legitimate research that could benefit human health. And it just doesn't, it's very hard for me to frankly understand why we continue to insist it's a Class I substance. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.